Hello everybody. So we will continue now on the chapter related to internal migration, and now we're going to concentrate on this topic related to domestic migration in the United States. So let's just go to slide 37 to start on this topic. So during the 19th and early 20th centuries, there was a steady stream of migration setting beyond the Mississippi River, and between the late 1800s and 1960s, the South had been the major exporter of people. So the South was losing people migrating out of the South and going to other areas in the country. And since the 1970s, the major inter-regional migration flows within the United States have been from east to west and from north to south. So it kind of inverts people getting out of the South and then now going to southern states. And here, whenever you're talking about west, midwest, northeast, and south, we are considering these groups of states in the US, and we mentioned about in the past people moving beyond the Mississippi River, going more to the west, and between the 1800s and 1960s, the South being the one losing more people going to other areas, and more recently people moving from the north to the south and also from the east to the west, as we mentioned here in the previous slide. And so for every 5-year period between 1970 and 2010, the southern states have been the only states that continuously experienced positive net migration. The West region has moved from positive to negative in 1995 and to slightly positive in 2010. The South and West were popular destinations, particularly among graduate degree holders who are 25 years or older. And the Midwest and Northeast regions have continuously had negative net migration. So just showing these results here of regional migration patterns in the US between 1970 and 2010, what it's written here is demonstrated in this graph. So the South always having positive net migration to all the southern states. The states in the West, they had positive, and then it started to be negative in 1995, and then in more recent years, slightly positive. And Midwest and Northeast, always negative net migration. And again, we are talking about internal migration, domestic migration. Domestic migration means the same thing as internal migration. And one important stream, one important flow of internal migration in the country historically was the Great Migration. So during the Great Migration between 1910 and 1970, over 6 million blacks, they moved out of the rural South to Midwest, Northeast, into the Pacific coast. So almost 90% of African Americans were living in the South in the 1900s. And then by 1970, the states of New York, Illinois, and California had received large numbers of African Americans who moved from the areas in the rural south of the country and then moving to the specific states. And taking here information from another article that is mentioned at the end of this lecture in the references, the African American Great Migration from the south to the north happened during the 20th century, as I mentioned in the previous slide. African Americans were seeking better socioeconomic opportunities for their families, and the migration contributed to social, economic, demographic, and cultural transformations in northern cities in the country. And just to give an idea of African Americans in non-southern areas, so we see that it increased over time. So the black line here is the number in millions of African Americans who were born in the South but were then in those specific years living in areas outside of the south of the US. And the gray columns here, they show the total number of African Americans living in non-southern areas. So the gray bars here include even African Americans that were not born in southern states. And the black line, it's only for African Americans born in southern areas, but then who are in those specific years living in areas outside of the south of the US. And these maps here, this first one, it shows the Great Migration between 1916 and 1930. So we see these major migration corridors. So the blue one, the southwest, people moving from southwest to midwest and to the far west. The purple flows, or the purple corridors here, people moving from south central states into midwestern states. And the yellow migration corridor, people moving from southeast states and going to northeast states. And the cities here, the highlighted cities in red, are the major destination cities in those from those flows. And the southern states are highlighted here in green. And so many of the people that moved first to Kansas and Oklahoma, they after left those states and went to California. So that's this note here. And the Great Migration, so this map here shows the Great Migration between 1916 and 1930. The next slide shows the second Great Migration from 1940 to 1970. So if you compare the previous with this one here, you add some more flows, some more corridors, and also some more cities. So from 1916 to 1930, and then 1940 to 1970, you see some more cities that people are migrating from and to. So here, the migration corridor from the southwest to midwest and far west, you start seeing now people also moving to Oregon and to Washington State. And you still see people moving from south central to midwest and from the southeast to the northeast. And from the same paper by Tolna in 2003, he mentions that whites also moved to the north in large numbers between 1910 and 1970, so it was not only African Americans. However, whites did not experience disadvantaged positions as blacks in the south. So they were not experiencing the same disadvantaged positions as African Americans were having in the South when they moved to the North. And the segregation and concentration of poverty in the growing northern ghettos limited residential mobility of African Americans. So African Americans were looking for better life standards in northern areas, but exactly because of concentration of poverty and segregation, they still experienced limited residential mobility in northern areas. So this historical process has to be understood in order to further investigate black migration and mobility. So all the conditions that African Americans have nowadays, even in northern areas, it is still related to this historical process of segregation and concentration of poverty. So after this Great Migration process, or the post-Great Migration, changes contributed to the desire by black inner-city residents to relocate to the suburbs and to better neighborhoods within the North. So cross-generation familial and cultural connections also contributed for African Americans returning to the South. So some African Americans, that were in the North, moved to the North historically from previous generations. They, like more recent generations, they started doing better in terms of socioeconomic status, started to relocate to suburbs and to better neighborhoods in the North. And some of them also, because of family and cultural connections, decided to return to the South area, in the South region in the country. So only after changes took place in the South in terms of socioeconomic and political equality for blacks, return migration became more attractive. So just after changes when African Americans perceived that the South would provide better socioeconomic and political opportunities for them, that's when they started to return. And in terms of the recent migration that I mentioned at the beginning of this topic, after the 1970s, we see a reverse of migration within the US. Younger, college-educated migrants are moving to a more prosperous and post-civil rights South. So cities and metro areas of Atlanta, Dallas, Houston are among the most popular destinations for whites, blacks, and new immigrant minorities. So Houston, for example, has a really diverse population, and it's really due to this reversal migration. So people now moving to southern states exactly now that these cities are more prosperous and where they see more possibilities of equality for all different groups. And migration, as we have been talking since the beginning of the chapter, varies by a series of socioeconomic and demographic variables. So, for example, migration varies by age. Today, young adults, those between 20 and 29 years of age, they are more likely to move than anyone else, any other age group in the US. And reasons are related to school, people moving to other cities and to other areas to pursue college, for example, or to get a job, so because of looking for employment, and also related to marriage. And people who are at least 40 years of age are much less likely to move. Older people are more likely to stay in the area where they're living at the current year. Migration also varies by education. Highly educated people are more likely to migrate, and the farther they move, the more likely education will play a major role in the decision of moving. So usually higher educated people, they tend to move to farther away areas compared to lower educated people. So lower educated people, when they move, they tend to move shorter distances. And higher educated people with higher education, when they move, they tend to move to farther away areas compared to lower educated people. And in terms of variation of migration by occupation, white-collar workers are the most mobile occupation group. And this is a little bit related also to education. So higher educated people are also more mobile than the lower educated people. So we see that among white-collar workers as well. Farm and service workers are the least likely to migrate within the US. Manual workers are more likely to move locally within the US. People who are not in the labor force are also likely to move because they are looking for jobs. So they might be looking for jobs and then they move to other areas within the US looking for job opportunities. And so migration has a series of different consequences. First, the decision to migrate is likely reached when advantage of moving to the destination outweigh the disadvantage of staying in the area of origin. So this is related to some of the diagrams that I discussed in the beginning of this chapter. And so population movements, small or large, they have effects on the places of origin and destination. And more than that, they also affect movers and non-movers. So migration affects places of origin, destination, and also migrants and non-migrants. And the effect of moving for an individual migrant differs from the effect of an aggregate migration population. So I will just discuss a little bit here these different effects, the individual effects of migration and the aggregate effects of migration. The effects of individual migrant. Major effects of migration are experienced through an individual migrant. So whether social, economic, political, or physical characteristics of a new environment are more favorable or preferable than those of previous residents are going to vary depending on the individual characteristics. So these preferences usually depend on migrants' personal observations and experiences, whether the migrant possesses the right skills to adapt to the new area, and where the migrant is readily accepted. So individual migrants, when they move, their life change. And that changes in relation to all these different characteristics of the new area of destination. And whether these different characteristics of the new area of the destination will be favorable to the individuals, will be good for them in the long term, will depend on individual characteristics, right? So specific individuals with better skills, with, like, for example, if someone has better job skills than the others, and for the specific jobs in the area of destination, they will adapt faster and compared to other workers in the area. And what about the effects of aggregate migration? The area of origin is affected by the number and the type of migrants moving out of the area. A large out-migration will significantly affect an area's potential population growth. So, for example, if the net migration rate is highly negative and the population is staying in that area of origin is largely elderly, that will prevent that area of origin to have economic growth. So that's going to affect that area negatively in terms of economic growth. So the migration streams, they benefit specific individuals if they have specific qualities that the area of destination is looking for, but also the areas of origin and destination are affected as a whole, as an aggregate, when we have these migration flows. And the effects of immigration, there are two ways that immigration contributes to the increase of population in the area of destination. First, the net number of immigrants constitutes a direct effect of population increase. So the number of people, for example, moving from one state to the other is the direct effect of immigration in the US. And the number of children born to the immigrants after they arrive to the destination is the indirect effect. So, for example, people moving from New York State to Texas, they are the direct effect of migration from New York State to Texas. And after they arrive in Texas, and the children that they have in Texas are the indirect effect of this migration flow from New York State to Texas, for example. And what's the magnitude of this effect? The magnitude of the direct effect depends on the relative size of the migrants compared to the receiving population. So in this example, what's the size of these people moving from New York State to Texas compared to the population in Texas? That's the magnitude of the direct effect. And the magnitude of the indirect effect depends on the relative levels of reproductive behavior of migrants compared to the receiving population. So, for example, the same example, those people moving from New York State to Texas, they are the direct effect. And are their fertility behavior, the amount of children that they have on average, higher than the number of children that Texans have? That tells us the magnitude of the indirect effect, which is exactly the children born to the immigrants after they arrive in the destination. I also included in the course website this interview that NPR did with William Frey, who is a demographer at the Brookings Institute, and this is the link to listen to his interview. It's a short interview, 5 minutes, and he talks about recent trends in migration. And I included this link in the course website as well. You can listen over there. So the United States has been experiencing the lowest levels of internal migration since the late 1940s. So back between 1950 and 1960, around 20% of the people were migrating within the US. And at that time, the US population had a robust economy. So had a robust economy, people migrating a lot, looking for better job opportunities and so on. Nowadays, only 9.8% of the American population is moving to other areas in the country. So that's based on 2019 data. So William Frey, he discusses of possible reasons for this decline from 20 to 9.8. And he mentions maybe now because you have an older population in the US proportionally compared to previous years, then, and this population is less likely to migrate, as we talked in previous slides, then that could be a reason for the decline in internal migration in the US. Also, he mentions that the labor market is more homogeneous across the country in more recent years than in previous years. So maybe now it doesn't matter if I live in the West or East or North or South of the country, because the labor market across the country is more homogeneous in terms of good jobs that I can get. People tend to stay put in where they are, so they have lower chances to migrate. That's another hypothesis as well. And William Frey also brings the 2008 economic recession, the housing bust, as some of the reasons for the decline of internal migration in the US in recent years. And the fact that people can now telecommute and do their jobs from home, that might be another reason that people don't have to move to other cities and to other states in order to get a specific job. They can stay where they are. But he suggests that internal migration might increase again. We don't know exactly, but based on his analysis from previous decades, from previous years in the US, he suggests that maybe around 12% of Americans will move within the US per year instead of 9.8%. But that's a hypothesis that we'll be able to see in the coming years. But this is interesting to show that this issue or this topic about internal migration in the US, it's still needs more research about it. So we have to better understand what are the reasons behind this decline, and there is a lot of studies that can be done on this topic to better understand these internal migration flows in the US. So this is I finish here this topic about domestic migration in the US on the chapter about internal migration. Thank you very much.